SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Hello friends, we are meeting once again to discuss American literature. This is a paper 314 co-paper of semester 6, and there are 3 short stories. All the 3 short stories are from American literature. Today we are going to discuss about the third story, that is a true story by Mark Twain. As we proceed with the lecture, the first thing that I would like to discuss would be about the author. Mark Twain as a writer, his contributions to American literature, and in particular we will discuss about his true story. The author was born in 1835 and he died in 1910. During this tenure, he has contributed immensely to American literature through short stories, and some of his famous works include The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, The Adventures of Huckleberry. These are his famous works. The best part is that Mark Twain, as he is known to all of us, the readers of American literature, is his pen name. His real name is Samuel Langhorne Clemens, and none of us have ever read any of the books where his real name is used. But interestingly, the story, a true story as it is titled, somewhere we get a feel that the character Mr. C is Clemens himself. So there is an element of autobiographical element that you can see in his work here. An American author, as we all know, and a humorist. His writing can be divided into 2 different categories. His initial writing started, he started contributing, writing very light, humorous kinds of verses. But later on, the analysis of man's vanities, shortcomings, and double standards that you find in day-to-day life, these things were exhibited in his works. The other speciality of this writer is that he uses colloquial speech in his works. Being a realist writer, realism as a trend talks about creating realistic imaginations where even the speech used by the characters would appear to be very realistic. And the colloquial speech that he uses in his works, especially for the characters, the Negroes, or we call them as the niggers, this particular speech is very largely used in this particular story of Mark Twain. And therefore, while we will discuss the story, I would also like to talk about some of the words that he has tried to use in his works. This is the distinctive genre of American literature because he focuses on the language, he focuses on the themes. The themes and the language are purely American, and therefore he is considered to be a stalwart in American literature. Interestingly, in 1865, a story titled The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. It's a humor story which got global acclaim, and he was awarded for that particular story. He got a lot of recognition for that story. When we talk about Mark Twain, there are many writers who have contributed to American literature, but if we look at his writings, we can certainly say that his is a truly American voice, because he talks about the concerns of the people, especially the blacks. He's concerned about the issues that are very sensitive to the nation, and herein he talks about, in the story, about the slavery which was quite prevalent before the Civil War or during the Civil War. He has an irreverent humor in his writings and biting social satire. That is again one of his quality that you find in his writings. All his writings are known for realism of place and language. He has created many memorable characters, as I already mentioned about the adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. These are famous characters created by Mark Twain. But in this story, a true story, he talks about Aunt Rachel. It's a story of a black Negro woman and the kind of troubles that she undergoes. Her family is separated, and all the difficulties that she goes through during this phase, this is being discussed in this story. It's a very memorable character that you find here. Henry is the son, the youngest son of Aunt Rachel. Twain's hatred of hypocrisy and oppression is also very much visible in his works here. He is known for using the dialects. The dialect that is used here is extensively used rather in the story. I'll read out few passages from the stories to give you a feel of how the typical dialects of the American slaves, rather the Negro woman, how she speaks. That is very much visible in this particular story. Now, how he used to go about, he was so interested in this dialects that are used by the writer, by the people, that he used to go around recording this use of the dialects of different people, and he used to recreate those speech, the dialect, in his writings. And therefore, when we read Mark Twain's A True Story, you will find that there is so much of originality in the writing, in the language that is used by Aunt Rachel in this story, that it becomes very convincing to the reader. As I mentioned earlier, these are two of his most famous works, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Most of his writings talks about 19th century America and the way the blacks were treated, they were exploited, they were used and sold as slaves. So different stories of slavery interested him, and he tried to write those stories, especially with an aim to sensitize the people. Now, when we come to the story, you'll find Aunt Rachel, the protagonist of the story. She's a cook in the narrator's house. He's used a very different style and technique while he's attempted the story. And that is, the story begins with a conversation between the two narrators. So there are two narrators here. The first one is the narrator. You might say it's the voice of the author as well, because it's based on a true incident which we'll talk about. And there is a dialogue which is initiated at the very beginning of the story. It's a story of truth and pathos. There is a lot of pain and anguish of the slaves who were exploited by the whites. The protagonist is a southerner black Southern black woman, and that is Aunt Rachel. To give originality to the character, as I said earlier, Mark Twain has recorded the dialects, and he has sort of learned how these people talk, and he has used that southern drawl. Now, how is a southern drawl? It's been explained. You can check the monitor, and you will find that southern drawl is an accent with prolonged vowels, wherein the speaker speaks very, very slowly. Aunt Rachel uses this typical southern drawl in her speech, and it's very interesting, and it's very real, true to the realism that he believed in. Smiles in spite of all odds. Now, who smiles? It's Aunt Rachel who smiles in spite of all odds. You will find that the story begins with the narrator asking Aunt Rachel as to what is the reason that she keeps smiling and being cheerful all the time. Is it because she has never had any hardships in her life? There are no troubles in her life that makes her cheerful, keeps her cheerful always. But here is a story of a lady who is cheerful despite all odds. She's learned to deal with adversities so well that she's never ever talked about to her master about her past till she is, sort of asked by the narrator as to what is the reason. She gets provoked in a manner that she starts narrating the story. And here is where she starts talking about her life story to her master. And that's how we have the two narrators. The first narrator is the master or the author, the voice of the author, and then comes the true narrator who talks about her story, who narrates her story to the narrator, wherein she talks about how she had a family, she had a very loving and affectionate husband, and she had 7 children, and how they were sold off one after the other until the last one, the youngest one was Henry, who was also sold, which created a lot of pain and anguish in her heart. Despite all this, she's cheerful and always willing to work. It's a subtle critic of the practice of slavery. The story stands for that. It talks about the exploitation of the blacks in the American history, and it is a tale of an enslaved mother's suffering. If we talk about the story in a nutshell, as I said earlier, Aunt Rachel with her 7 children, husband and all children sold off at the auction. And while she's narrating this, she's anguished. She talks with a lot of pain about her youngest son, Henry, who was also sold. She tries to protest in the beginning when one by one her family members were being sold off. But then she was beaten very badly by the whites, and Henry even tore his wrist and got his head smashed, which left his scar on his forehead. That's very important to be noticed when this is mentioned here, because later on the story has some connection with the scar. Now, Henry, when he sees the pain of his mother, the anguished mother, he tries to console her while he whispers into her ears. This is very touching, this particular line. I quote, "I will run away, work and buy your freedom." The general, when Henry talks this, that I will run away, work and buy your freedom, what did he mean? He said, don't worry. He is trying to console his mother not to weep, but he will come back. He will ensure that they are freed from the clutches of slavery. The general, when he says to Rachel, don't be afraid, you are among friends. This is also this particular statement by the general is important because when Aunt Rachel is working as a cook at her master's place, and when I'll just quote from the story wherein the Union says the master was a colonel who had left, and Aunt Rachel was the family's cook. But when the colonel left, the Unions took over the town. All the people, the entire colonel and his members, family members, they all ran away, and she was left to fend for herself. And she got so scared, but when the big Union officers got in, they sort of said that not to worry about, right? Don't be afraid. You are among friends. Now Henry hired himself as a servant to officer after officer. Once he was sold, he ensured that he wanted to come back. He wanted to reunite with his mother as he had promised his mother. So he had no idea where he was being taken away and where his mother would be at that point of time. So he kept hiring himself as a servant to officer after officer, not staying at one place, to look for his mother. And it is then that there is a twist in the story when there is a soldier ball which takes place at Aunt Rachel's place, and there is a nigger regiment which arrives on a Friday night, and the soldiers when they spot Rachel with a big red turban at the ball, they start making fun of her. But as it is, every time she sees people, she is looking for her son Henry, and it's so fortunate that she found Henry in the nigger regiment,